50 years ago, they risked their lives to bring supplies to a city cut off from the Western world. Fly with an American pilot when he returns to celebrate the battle for Berlin.
631 Alpha Heavy.
It was one of the most extraordinary feats in aviation history.
The greatest feeling of fulfillment I've had is on the airlift.
American and British pilots fighting to save 2.5 million people.
It's the underside of this huge DC-3 roaring past us like the belly of a whale of some sort. It was scary as hell, really.
They risked their lives to rescue a besieged city. If they failed, it meant starvation and Soviet domination.
I just didn't want the Russians back. We little kids, all we knew is the Americans are here.
I'm Gail Halverson, one of the airlift pilots from 50 years ago, now flying back across the Atlantic to commemorate the 50th anniversary when we flew supplies to save the city of Berlin.
May 1998, 77-year-old Colonel Gail Halverson is flying back in time. Back to when he was a 27-year-old pilot, flying to Berlin.
The first time that I saw Berlin from the air, it looked like a moonscape. I looked down there and I wondered, how in the world can 2.5 million people survive in that rubble heap?
Months of Allied bombing at the end of World War II had decimated Berlin. And the Red Army had taken their revenge for Nazi atrocities in Russia. Germany had been divided between the victorious Allies. Berlin was split. The Soviets getting the East, the US, Britain, and France the West. The city they had conquered was on the verge of starvation. Peter McCoy was 7 years old at the time and living in Berlin. He will never forget his desperate hunger.
I would go out on the streets with all of a little rat pack of little friends, all ages, little kids, and we would scour the neighborhood. We would look for food in trash cans, potato peels maybe someone threw away foolishly, crusts of bread with green mold on them. We'd eat them because it was something that would sustain us, that would at least drive away for a little bit the hunger pangs.
The Soviets saw this hunger, but for them, it was an opportunity. The Red Army already controlled most of Eastern Europe. Now they wanted all of Berlin, too.
So they shut the door on West Berlin. They wanted to starve out the Allies and hope that they would leave, and leave Berlin to the Russians.
June 24th, 1948. What so many feared happened. Soviet troops shut down all road, rail, and canal routes into the city.
From my little boy's perspective, all I heard was that the Russians aren't letting trucks in. No more food. They're not letting trains in. No more trains. And for a long while, long in the mind of a little boy, it scared us.
The Soviets cut the power supply, and Berlin was plunged into darkness. The city was under siege. At the border, food lay rotting in railroad cars. And in the city, there were rations enough for little more than a month. Mercedes Wild was just a little girl. She still remembers how it felt, not knowing where her next meal would come from.
All at once, there was nothing to eat anymore. The stores were all empty. It seemed like it was the end, like it was all over.
But then, the Allies decided to fight back. There was one way they could save Berlin: by mounting a massive airlift. Halverson was one of the first to hear the news. Stationed on a U.S. Air Force base, he was an amateur filmmaker and would put together a unique chronicle of the remarkable events that followed.
I was flying foreign transport operations out of Mobile, Alabama, and we got called into a pilot meeting by Colonel Cassidy and said, look, the Soviets have blockaded the city of Berlin and we need volunteers to leave immediately. So I volunteered to go the airlift.
He was among hundreds of American pilots who headed for Germany. Their challenge was immense, to feed and supply a city the size of Philadelphia by air. It had never been attempted before. The only man with experience in mounting an airlift on this scale was General William Tunner. Tunner had supplied U.S. troops in China by organizing perilous flights over the highest mountains in the world, the Himalayas. Now he was in charge of what would become the biggest humanitarian airlift in history. The Air Force dubbed it Operation Vittles. The Allies scrambled every available cargo plane, rounding up a hodgepodge of aircraft from all over the world. Everything from U.S. Air Force C-54s to RAF flying boats. Pilots who 3 years before had been bombing Berlin were now flying over the same city to save lives.
Well, during the war, we perceived the Germans as mortal enemies. So on my first trip to Berlin with those thoughts in my mind, I landed at Tempelhof, and this big semi-trailer backed up to the back door, and it opened, and in streamed about 6 Germans, some with a uniform hat or a uniform coat or a mixed civilian uniform. And I went back to take a look. And the first one in line walked up to me and put out his hand, a signal of friendship. They looked at those sacks of flour back there and looked at us like we're angels from heaven.
Supplies were ferried in from bases across West Germany. The planes had to fly over hostile territory, down corridors just 20 miles wide. If they strayed, they risked being shot down. Before he was recruited for the airlift, Jack Bennett was chief pilot for American Overseas Airways.
I rolled in Tempelhof and the Russians lobbed mortar shells over my airplane. I knew right away that the Russians did not want us in Berlin. This was not a Cold War, this was a hot war.
It wasn't only the Russians the pilots had to worry about. Just landing at Tempelhof could be a nightmare.
On the end of the runway was a 5-story apartment house. And to get down quickly enough to get stopped, we had to kind of pop up over it and then come down very quickly. We didn't have an asphalt or cement runway, hard surface. We had pierced steel planking locked together with holes in the middle. You step on the brakes and lock the brakes and it'd peel off the rubber just like a potato peeler, taking off the peels of a potato. Blowing tires. And that was tough.